You know, there was there of course was an abolitionist movement in the North that got, you know, a lot of attention back in the 1850s and leading up to the Civil War. But there was an abolitionist in the Northeast, and I think it was from Vermont, that I have a lot of respect for, and you will probably recognize his name, Lysander Spooner. Now, Spooner was a definite abolitionist. He was a Northerner. He was a Yankee. But when it came down to the war, in spite of all those identifications, he identified with the South and said the South was on the right side of the issue. And yet the war advanced regardless, and it was pursued, of course, with so much pain and suffering. And it was, and the country was led to believe, and every one of our public schools since then have preached and harped and pounded it into our kids that the only issue that was involved was slavery. And yet that was the excuse, and that was the rabble-rousing issue, and it was, you can't deny that it was an important issue. That really wasn't the issue of why the war was fought, in my estimation. You know, there were over 11 countries up until that time and shortly thereafter in this hemisphere, in North and South America. 11 different countries that had slavery. Every one of them got rid of slavery without war. There were different vehicles. There was legislation, and one of the techniques they used was literally buying slaves' freedom, which makes a lot of sense when you think of the cost of war. Not only the 600 to 700,000 American deaths, but the loss of liberty, the untold cost. So there must have been a tremendous motivation for that war to be fought. Of course, I see it in historic terms, because even at the very beginning of our country, there was a major debate. Those who were the Jeffersonians, and those other ones who were the Hamiltonians. Hamilton wanted a strong centralized government. Jefferson, of course, wanted a decentralized government. And in many ways, they sort of split. And that sort of set the stage for problems later on. But Hamilton really didn't have his way completely, because although they did have a central bank early on, Jefferson got rid of it one time and Jackson got rid of it another time. But the ideas that they pursued basically were protectionism, which helped northern manufacturers, and they also advocated a central banking system, and also support and subsidies to big business. And those were the three major points of what Hamilton believed in, but really and truly it was exactly what Lincoln's program was as well. So when they saw this opportunity, they used the issue of slavery to precipitate the war and literally cancel out the whole concept of individual choice. You know, I think one of the most important parts of the Declaration of Independence says that governments are instituted among men, and they're deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So if you have a true republic, the consent of the people is very important. And it was the consent of the states that allowed the United States to come together. So without the consent, it doesn't exist. So they really, through the Civil War, threw that out completely and rejected the notion that the consent came from the people and from the individual states, but rather it came from the monolithic, more powerful, centralized government. And unfortunately, that is what we have had to live with for these so many years, and has given us so many more problems. The issue of secession, I think, is a key issue. You know, there was, I can't remember exactly who it was, it might have been Dan Smoot or someone like that, many years ago said that countries should be measured, there's all degrees of freedom, very free, less free, but he says you have to draw a line someplace. He says the countries that you shouldn't deal with are the countries that don't allow their people to leave. You know, and at that time it was very easy. The Soviets, you know, built walls around, and the Chinese wouldn't let their people leave, and there were walls around the Soviet Union. And if you tried to get out, you would get shot. So obviously they weren't free. So in a way, in a relative sense, that's the principle we're dealing with. We're dealing with the idea of whether or not we as individuals can leave. We should be able to leave anytime we want. You say, well, you can. If you want to move, you can, which is true. But more so every day, it is less likely that you can leave with all your money or send your money first. So there's already limitations on our freedom of movement with our assets as well as our persons. But the issue of leaving is the key to whether or not we live in a free society. Now the issue of secession was, it was acknowledged by the founders. Jefferson just assumed. Most of the founders assumed that anybody who wanted to leave could leave. But then again, that attitude changed by the 1860s. Now, in the Hartford Convention in 1814, 1815, they talked about serious secession. Nobody questioned it legally. Nobody questioned the issue of secession in 1814, 1815, this convention. But it was the Northern Yankee group, the Northeasterners, wanted to secede from the Union. It didn't come about, but it was never challenged intellectually, legally, or constitutionally whether or not they had the right to leave the Union. And yet it was established by the time the Civil War broke out that it would be absolutely prohibited. One of the other major reasons why the South was so aggravated over what the North was doing had to do with the tariff. I'm convinced of that, and I think history bears this out. There are some estimates that say that at that time, since the federal government was living off the tariff, you know, that's when government was still very limited, and it may not be a bad way to finance a government, and we could do it with the proper size tariff. But the whole government was financed by this abusive tariff, which was biased against the South. The South was paying 90% of all the federal revenues into the coffers. And that obviously was an issue. The issue of whether or not there was state sovereignty was major. The issue of tariffs was very major. The issue of slavery also was very important, but it was now declared at that time for the agitation, and at least for our history since then, said that that was the only issue. And it could have been solved in other ways. Other countries solved it, and it's just a tragedy that it did not happen. You know, a lot of bad ideas came out of that period. I think our country really, well, we started to lose the Republic probably the day after it was established, you know, with the fights going on, the way the Constitution was imperfectly written. But at least through the 19th century they did pretty well, and I would say the Depression and the wars through the 20th century, just continual erosion of the principles of the Republic and individual liberty. But during the Civil War period, they sure introduced a lot of bad ideas. One of the worst, which had been rejected by all the previous governments and members of Congress up until that time, was the issue of the draft. But the draft was used to conscript Northerners. They conscripted many, many thousands. But what is interesting are those who didn't get conscripted. Of course, you could buy your way out of the draft at that time. But there's an estimate that during that war period, 200,000 Northern military people deserted the Army, 120,000 evaded the draft, and 90,000 went to Canada. Here, most of us thought the only people who ever went to Canada was during Vietnam. But they started it early on, and there were some court cases back then on the legality and constitutionality of the draft, and there were a lot of shenanigans that went on with the courts while the courts, it was ruled unconstitutional, but through some procedures they were able to just ignore it. Yeah, another issue issue that came up during the Civil War period that was there for a while and it was kicked out, but eventually came back, and that was the income tax. The income tax was imposed and then ruled unconstitutional, was taken back, but it kept coming back, and of course we know what kind of a horrible tax system that we have today. But the seeds were planted back in the Civil War period. And I have a simple solution for that. I have a bill for that. And that is get rid of the income tax, get rid of the IRS completely. Now the other thing that came up, I guess you can say, well, it happened then. Now we're seeing this type of approach under the Patriot Act and under Ashcroft's rule, and that is habeas corpus, rid of habeas corpus. You know, there is a provision that says it can be suspended by the Congress, not by the President. The President doesn't go to war and he doesn't have these powers. I mean, the founders were genius, and they didn't give it to the people in the Congress, they gave it to the states. So it wasn't ever given to, so little was given to the administration and to the executive branch. And yet today, we live in an age where not only have the rights of the states been trampled on, but the executive branch is way too big. All policing activities, other than those laws that were written in the Constitution like treason and piracy and counterfeiting, all laws of violence should be handled by the states themselves and not by the federal government. Do you have any idea now how many federal bureaucrats who are now policemen because they carry guns? 90,000 federal, that's an army, and they have guns. Now I've changed my mind about all this gun stuff. I've decided that we need really strict gun control. No federal bureaucrat should be allowed to have a gun. But what did we do after 9/11? You know, if we really understood the Second Amendment and the airlines had been responsible for their property, like the armored trucks are responsible for their money. You know, we have private guards and they haul money around and they have guns and nobody robs armored trucks. But if you're if you own an airline and you haul around just passengers and people, you don't have the right. You don't have the right to have guns and protect them and have a responsibility. The responsibility was always on the government to decide who gets on airplanes and not. And now here we are. The first thing they did after 9/11, or one of the first things, was to nationalize all the security and all the checks. And they get to carry the guns, and they say, oh yeah, we're gonna let the pilots carry guns, but only under the rules and regulations of the federal government. So they're trying to give they claim they're giving the right for pilots to carry guns. Well, they already have that right. We shouldn't be giving the pilots or the airlines the right to carry guns and protect themselves. That right is natural. It should have been there a long time ago. And no pilot has yet been armed. You know, if one was more inclined to be a constitutionalist and libertarian the day after 9/11, I think the president should have, by executive order, by eliminating the restriction, saying, look, get armed, put a gun on there, and you're responsible. And I think that would have solved a lot of problems very quickly and probably saved this country maybe $100 billion or more, because the expenses continue to go up, and unfortunately I don't feel a whole lot safer under current conditions because we're depending on bureaucrats rather than on ourselves. The other things that started during the Civil War period was the subsidies to big business. That was part of the platform, and of course protectionism. Now there's a lot of lip service given to free trade in Washington, but the truth is when you destroy a currency and you disrupt the economy, you encourage businesses to go overseas, and then you take money from the people and send it overseas to subsidize your competitors. It makes it tough on our business people. So this leads to, instead of getting rid of the subsidies and having sound money, They go the next step, and then they go in and say that back to protectionism, and let's put on tariffs and solve all our problems. That will not be a solution at all. You know, during this post-Civil War period, General Lee was corresponding with Lord Acton in Britain, who was a great philosopher and great believer in freedom, and also was the one that coined the phrase "power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And Lee had written him, and Lord Acton had written Lee, and Lee wrote back to him, and of course Lee was a grand gentleman, and he was, of course, very sad about what had happened to his country and to the Republic. But in this letter, this is what he told Acton. He said, the consolidation of the states into one vast republic, I guess today we could say one vast democracy, unfortunately. The consolidation of the state into one vast republic is sure to lead to aggression abroad and despotism at home. Boy, that is prophetic, because that's exactly where we are. We are now a democracy controlled by special interests, and the majority manipulated by all kinds of polling and advertising and lobbying and buying of members of Congress. And we are. If you look at Patriot Act 1 and the plans for Patriot Act 2, you talk about despotism at home. You talk about even before 9/11. Think of all the regulations and these bureaucrats with guns. And you know, so much of what came out of the Patriot Act #1 was not brand new. You know, the Department of Homeland Security was thought up by Gore. That was his proposal. And much of what was in Patriot Act #1 was already planned. And this was an opportunity. So the despotism at home is around us. And there's reason that we should be concerned. And it's a combination of our lack of respect and belief in liberty, at the same time, lack of respect for the process of believing in the Constitution and believing that local government and states should deal with our problems rather than the federal government.